Welcome to today's webinar, Basic Income and Climate Change. My name is Natasha Pei, Manager of Cities for Tamarack's Communities Ending Poverty. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on Indigenous land. As settlers, it is important to recognize the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous people and affirm our collective commitment to make the promise and challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. I'm calling from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I invite each of you to introduce yourselves in the chat box, including the traditional land from which you are calling as well. While you're introducing yourselves, I'd like to take a moment and thank Tom Cooper and the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction for helping to put these informative basic income webinars panels together over the last couple of years. You can learn more about the HRPR, the Hamilton Poverty Roundtable, by visiting www.hamiltonpoverty.ca. Now on to introducing our guest panel. Our first panelist, Mitchell Beer, is the publisher of The Energy Mix, which is an e-digest on climate change, energy, and the shift off of carbon. He is a steering committee member of the Green Resilience Project, which we will hear more about today, and in October 2019 delivered a TEDx talk, Ottawa, on building wider public demand for faster, deeper carbon cuts. Dr. Jim Mulvale is also here, who teaches social welfare policy, conducts research on universal basic income, social work theory, and designs curriculum related to social justice and ecological sustainability. He is also a steering committee member of the Green Resilience Project. We also have Janet Patterfung, who is a project manager for the Green Resilience Project, connecting with Canadians across the country on making links between climate change, income security, and community resilience. Before this, she was working in the nonprofit sector for just over 15 years, focusing on building capacity and program support, and spending the majority of her personal and professional career advocating for environmental protection. And finally, we have Scott Santens, who is the editor of Basic Income Today, which is a daily universal basic income news hub. He has been researching and advocating for basic income since 2013 and has also been living with a crowd-funded basic income since 2016. He's been acknowledged by Andrew Yang as one of the people who helped him shape his thinking, and described by Reuter Brigman as by far the most effective basic income activist out there. So welcome, Mitchell, Jim, Janet, and Scott, and thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar. I'm personally really excited to talk to you all today about basic income and climate change because I come from a social work background, and I'm familiar more with the case for basic income from a poverty reduction and an equality lens, but much less so from a climate change perspective. And I'm looking forward to the insights that you have to share. We know that we are living in a key moment in history. I was going to say, I think we feel like it, but I think we know that we're living through a key moment in history, not only because of COVID-19 and the pandemic, but because we're at a crucial tipping point in climate change. Our world leaders, including our Prime Minister, some virtually yourselves, and many members who are part of the Tamarack network are gathering in Glasgow right now at COP26 to call each other to action and figure out how we can have a coordinated global response to climate change and to meet our ambitious targets set internationally and nationally. In Canada, we have a goal to reduce greenhouse gases by 40% to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030, which is a mere 10 years away. And now we have the first Canadian emissions target enshrined in law to reach net zero by 2050, which is in line with the UN targets. And it feels like these targets are coming up fast. We don't have much of a track record meeting our climate change targets in Canada, and significant changes are ahead, particularly as it seems like we're always pulled to invest either in environment and climate change or in people. And I'd like to see on today's webinar if we can debunk that myth today, that it's one or the other, and look at basic income not only as a means to reduce poverty and improve inequality, but to also tackle climate change and look at an ambitious transformational way forward. So I see we already have Jim's slides up. Jim, at the 2018 NABIG, or North American Basic Income Congress, you stated that UBI is necessary, but not sufficient if we are going to achieve two fundamental preconditions for ecological sustainability and economy and a just and equal society. The first is ending overall economic growth, and the second is achieving a radical redistribution in income and wealth. So do you think we can find a balance between capitalism and a just green economy, and how does basic income factor into this?
Okay, big question, but important question. I think we can, and I think there's nothing like a crisis to motivate people's creative thinking, right? I mean, we've been living in a stressful time with COVID and climate change and continuing economic inequality. But I think people are at a point now where they're really willing to rethink some of our fundamental economic assumptions. We've got a long way to go, I think, especially with the political class that is still very much focused on economic growth. My argument is that we have to make a commitment to steady state economics, to ending overall economic growth, and sort of fundamental redistribution of wealth so that everybody has enough for a decent livelihood in which they can make choices about their path in life. One of the things I'm concerned about as somebody who studies social policy is the question of greenwashing. This slide here talks about the 6 sins of greenwashing, which I mean, I pulled this slide actually from a group that talks about greenwashing and public relations and the clothing industry, but arguably the same thing might happen with social policy, where sometimes we're told by governments that they're doing the right thing for climate, but maybe it's important to critically critically interrogate what they're claiming. So next slide, please. So I guess, and I'm kind of looking obviously here at the big picture, and I'll talk a little bit about very broad policy implications. And I think with some of the other speakers and the subsequent discussion, we'll drill down into kind of immediate practical steps and conversations that need to occur. But on the big picture stuff, I mean, if we're talking about a radically new economic paradigm, I mean, I think this is one in which we want to aim to end exploitation, to redistribute wealth and relocate economic room to grow from overdeveloped countries and over-consuming nations, which certainly includes Canada, but also recognizing there's nations in the world, in fact, the majority of nations in the world that are haven't enjoyed the economic development and comfortable lifestyles that those of us in the primarily northern countries enjoy. And I think a third kind of perspective on moving towards a new economic paradigm is provided to us from Indigenous peoples and Indigenous teachings about understanding Mother Earth in ways that kind of resonate with radical political ecology. So I think what we need to be thinking of in the big economic picture is moving to a society, an economy in which markets are embedded in societies, where I guess the old notion of Karl Polanyi that the way our capitalist system works on a global basis is that markets kind of determine what happens in societies, whereas we need to see social needs, social priorities as directing markets, kind of turn things upside down from the way things currently operate. We can be thinking about a social economy, more localized, less profit-seeking ways of distributing, manufacturing goods and providing services and distributing the same on a more local level and kind of in ways that enhance life rather than are just generate profits. And as I mentioned earlier, thinking in macroeconomic terms, moving to a steady state economy in which there's planned degrowth at the national and international level. One helpful guide in this, and I don't know if that slide could be brought up because there's a couple of interesting diagrams. The work that's been done by Kate Raworth in the UK on what is called donut economics. And she's got a very good visual. If we can just bring that up, Jamie, if possible, that one slide at least. This is, I think, a really useful and interesting model to, you see on the chart on the left, the green ring is what she calls the safe and just space for humanity, where there's consciousness of ecological limits on the outer dark green ring, but there's also consciousness and attention to the social foundation that everybody needs around human need and economic security. So if we can kind of plan our systems to be in that light green ring in between the two dark green circles, that's where societies and individuals thrive. The chart on the right, on the other hand, shows kind of what's happening now, according to Raworth, which I think is once again a good visual representation, where the red pieces tending towards the center are where we're falling short in areas like energy and health and food and housing and so on, and the red segments sticking out past the outer green ring are kind of how we're exceeding limits. So none of this is new, and I think it's all based on solid data, but kind of gives a good, interesting visual representation. So I've only got a couple of minutes left. Just moving on to some of the broad social policy implications. I think there's, well, here it is here on the slide. Universal basic income, if we're going to move towards a steady state economy that's sustainable in Raworth's terms, I'm seeing universal basic income as an essential component, but there's also a lot of other social policy areas that we have to be addressing, and maybe we'll get into some of those in the discussion. Housing, food security, different paradigms for healthcare, and ecologically focused education. So I won't spend time on that right now, but as I say, we may get into it later. And we'll move to the second last slide. So I think the earlier slide talked about social policy. This talks about broader public policy areas that need to be addressed. So we're obviously talking about a complex and multi-layered strategy here. There are no panaceas, including basic income, but solving complex, wicked problems like climate change requires complex thinking and multi-layered solutions. So I think these are some of the things we need to be thinking seriously about. And last slide, just to sum up, my essential point here is that, as Natasha mentioned earlier, basic income is a necessary but not sufficient component in this kind of social ecological transition that I'm speaking about here. It goes to like what happens to people in the fossil fuel industries, who many of whom are quite well paid, and what's in store for them in order to maintain a decent lifestyle for them and their families, but also move towards a economic system that's truly sustainable and economically just. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Jim. So from the macro to the micro, maybe I'll transition over to Scott. Scott, you've been researching, advocating for living on a basic income for several years now, and you went through Hurricane Ida recently. So how is what Jim is talking about resonating with you, the concept of complexity, the need for basic income as one of the good policies or programs that we need, and the idea of maximum limits and minimum limits for people?
Yeah, thanks. I would say just to start off, like kind of remaining at the macro perspective for a second, is just this. I think what's really important is that we can actually do a lot more with less. And so, just because we're using fewer resources doesn't mean we can't do more and accomplish more for more people. So I think like, productivity is a big part of this conversation. Um, and when you look at it that way too, like there's nothing as let's say wasteful and unproductive than as doing something that's entirely unnecessary or doing something that's even harmful. And so in this conversation, I think basic income is something that, say, enables people to, say, shift gears. And, something like a 4-day work week, is important, where you can actually still accomplish just as much in 5 days and 4 days. That's something that's great for the environment. It's great for people. And basic income actually enables more flexibility in that, to actually do less and actually focus on what's important. And another part of this too is like David Graeber's definition of BS jobs, where he's this talking about this concept of like this unnecessary work that people are doing, and really they're doing it just to get an income. And so if you make sure that people have an income unconditionally, then that's a really great way to filter out that unnecessary work. And that's something that's really important for the environment, or to get rid of that stuff, squeeze out that unnecessary labor. And then there's the harmful stuff you want to squeeze out. So, there's things that we're doing just to live that is very harmful to the environment, and people don't necessarily want to be doing it. And when people have a basic income, they have more choice and can actually do things that are better for society and better for the environment than what they have felt that they had no choice but to do. And so now to zoom into like a micro level, it was a really interesting experience evacuating from Ida here in New Orleans. It was the first time where I had to evacuate for a long period or an extended period of time. We've evacuated before for hurricanes and then come right back. But this one I was evacuated to Houston in Texas for 10 days. And basic income, like having this and knowing that, say, on the first of the next month, I was going to have, this more money that I could count on no matter what, um, really made a difference. And I could see the implications for, a lot of ways of using it that would be really helpful to people. And so this kind of like, enabling to seek higher ground, like in a literal sense kind of thing. So like, people, it's more difficult to evacuate some kind of disaster coming if you don't have the money to afford it. If you don't have the gas money, then if you don't have the money for their hotel rooms, then you're going to say, well, I'm going to stay here and wait it out and hope for the best. And that's how like things really, that bad things happen when someone ends up dying as a result of feeling they couldn't leave. And then when you actually evacuate, then there's these issues with the assistance programs that the government can come in with. So like for here, like FEMA, one of the things that they did is they said that, if you we're going to have like partnerships with hotels. And then if you're like a FEMA approved hotel, then you go there and you just have your shown like your FEMA number from like applying, and you can stay there, for free. And then like the reality of that is people would go to these hotels and the hotels are like, I don't know what you're talking about. So, if you want to stay here, then you've got to pay. And so people like ended up going to these places and they needed money to stay there. And, these programs failed at what they were supposed to do, but cash actually works in all these situations where these programs don't. So that was another aspect. And then coming home from all this, part of what happened in Ida was that we lost electricity for an extended amount of time. That's why we couldn't return. And so part of that is that basically everything in your fridge is garbage now. You've got to replace everything. So that can be really expensive. That's like one of those kind of, unforeseen costs, that to replace everything in your fridge and your freezer. And, coming back from being evacuated, where we stopped at a grocery store, and first of all, like their systems were all out, so they couldn't accept debit cards or EBT cards. For those who don't know, EBT is like our food voucher program here in the US that has distributed, how that's distributed. So like people who really needed to refill their fridges, they had food vouchers, those food vouchers didn't work because the systems were down. You needed cash. And so whereas we went to an ATM machine, got cash, and then got the food, I imagine so many people weren't able to do that, especially if you had no ability because you were utilizing food vouchers. So that was another aspect. And to be able to it's this ability that basic income has to be anything is really important for resilience, as far as being able to adapt to the realities of climate change. So, yes, we want to slow emissions as much as we can, and to reach our targets in order to dial back. But in the meantime, we're going to keep going forward, and things are going to be worse. So you have to make sure that people actually have that ability to be resilient. And this impacts so many other things, because again, it can be anything. So like Jim's slide that's about like how basic income is not the only thing. It's not like some silver bullet, but it's something that's necessary, and it really achieves so much of the other things that we want. So like it improves healthcare, so that if a population is healthier, you're going to need less hospital medical care, because you're healthier. So that means you're using fewer resources, because you need fewer resources for healthcare. It means that the money put into education actually goes further. It means that things like food insecurity and homelessness, like those are two obvious things that basic income actually help improve. There's just so many ways that basic income really is useful to people. And it's also not just money too. It's really important that people understand that this is about this feeling of security, that that you are going to that have these resources later, and that sense of security really has a lot of the health implications, especially for mental health, and enables so much of what we need to even like expand our thinking when it comes to the climate crisis. Because if you're living this insecure, barely able to get by every month kind of thing, then you're looking just with tunnel vision. And we need to get people out of that tunnel vision, and a way to really do that is to actually increase the amount of security and stability in their lives.
Thanks, Scott. I like how you reframe that as resilience. I keep thinking about basic income as helping us to mitigate the impacts of climate change, but really what we're looking at with basic income is resilience. That's the goal we want to work towards, and it's more than just environmental resilience. It's resilience to other pandemics. It's resilience to any shocks that hit us. So that we really appreciate. Thank you for sharing your experience. Mitchell and Janet, I'm going to turn it over to you. Now you're coming a little bit more from to the basic income conversation from the environmental side of things. So how is what you're hearing from Jim and Scott resonating with you? And what are some of the other arguments for basic income from a climate change perspective?
Go ahead, Mitchell.
I was just about to say, Janet, would you like to start? Well, I guess.
So polite.
Sorry, go ahead. I'll mute for now. Go ahead.
Go. Oh God, we're just too polite. Well, no, I was just going to say that a lot of what Scott and Jim are saying resonates. I think like so many other things in our, capitalist colonial landscape that we live in, the environmental movement has been the funded environmental movement has been dominated by privileged people with time and security, often white people who have, the capacity to focus on this. And I think there is slowly a growing awareness that this needs to change. And I think also a maybe too slowly growing awareness that It's not just a matter of inviting people to a table that's already set, but that we need a new table. Maybe we need to sit on the ground. People dealing most directly with climate impact need to be at the front leading the change. We need all hands on deck right now. And if basic income is the piece of the puzzle that is going to enable that, then that's, you know, where we need to go. Like, we're living in this, we're seeing right now with the pandemic how the system that we live in deals with a crisis. We're getting a lesson in that. And I think one of the lessons is that we can't solve the climate crisis without addressing root causes. And, you know, with the way that we're doing it now, you know, who's it working? Who's it working out for? What can we be doing differently at a larger scale? Like with this COP26 conference that's happening right now, that is on a lot of our minds. You know, there are commitments being made. Canada has made this commitment to net zero by 2050. There will be economic impacts. There is also climate impacts, and whether people believe that the climate crisis is real, whether they believe it's man-made, there will be effects within our economy. We're on this road already. So the question is, how do we weather this storm? How do we, you know, remain resilient in the face of these changes? I would also like to add that there has been this rhetoric in the environmental world, or I'd say imposed on the environmental world, that kind of pits hardworking people against the environment. But at the end of the day, if you ask anyone, you know, when you're thinking about the young people in your life, do you want them to have clean air and clean water? They're going to say yes. You know, if you ask them, is it critical that people have a fleet of sports cars? Most people will probably say no, but they will say that dignity, comfort, knowing where your next meal is coming from, this is essential. There is common ground to be found on these essentials. And, you know, I will go ahead and say that finding the common ground on this is not necessarily in the interest of those who would like to maintain a low bar with our environmental policy. But I think that, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, we do need to come together and find this common ground. I've been speaking with a lot of organizations across Canada over the past few months. I spoke to an activist yesterday, and she was saying that one of the greatest barriers that she faces for people in her community to participate in climate adaptation activities is time. The people in her community don't have time because they're spending all of their time just trying to make ends meet. And that doesn't just apply to low-income people. That applies to most working people. As someone myself, I'm a working parent. I spend all of my time working to pay for childcare, and then I'm taking care of my child. I have had to pull back on my own, you know, community activity. So yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, yeah, with this climate crisis that we're facing and how to address it without leaving people behind, but also putting people most at risk in leadership roles is one of the most urgent questions of our time. You know, we're talking about our survival at this point. So yeah, that's my thoughts.
I think that the sense of security and resilience that we've all been talking about might, I hope, be a path by which action on climate change actually creates a moment of opportunity to really push forward fast on basic income. And the fact that a webinar speaker can try to connect these dots doesn't necessarily mean that they will connect this way, but maybe there's a better chance they will if we all push for it to happen. We have just in the last few months, more powerfully than ever before, and certainly over the last couple of years, heard agencies like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and now, astonishingly, the International Energy Agency. I did not think we would see this happen in our lifetimes. Essentially saying that we need to, for practical purposes, phase out fossil fuel production by the middle of the century. They're talking about, for our colleagues in the US mainly, an end to coal. They're talking about 75% less oil production, 55% less gas production by 2050. And depending on where you live right now in energy and climate, that's either the target we're aiming for or something really scary that puts a target on your back. If the work is on emission reductions and addressing the impacts of climate change in a way that's just and leaves no one behind, then wow, are you really telling me the IEA is on board with this? Cool, let's go. And if you work in fossil fuels, if it's your livelihood, if it has been your family's livelihood for generations, if you live in a community that is 5% or 20% responsible on fossil fuel income, then that's absolutely terrifying. And in a way, I mean, it's not my place to say that because I'm fortunate not to live in a fossil fuel community. But the point is that the fact that that's terrifying is an issue for all of us, because if we really mean it about leaving no one behind, then it's on all of us to make sure that those communities, whether they are in the Wood Buffalo region of Alberta or Espen, Saskatchewan, or Appalachia in the US, or all of the other, I'll say in economic terms, sacrifice zones around the world, no one gets left behind. Who hasn't already been left behind by climate impact? I better add that, we're in the middle of the COP. So that has led to a lot of conversation about a just transition out of fossil fuel employment and out of community dependency on fossil fuel. In Canada, there was a report in late January this year, where a former trade union economist, Jim Stanford, found that really there are only 18 communities in Canada that as of 2016 drew at least 5% of their employment from fossil fuels. So good news, bad news. 18 communities is a challenge we can get our arms around. And that's the scope of the challenge, because again, nobody gets left behind. Where I really hope we can see a connecting point for basic income, and one of the reasons that I really hope it is that this was the line of thought that opened the conversations that led to the Green Resilience Project, was that, and I have this conversation a lot because for those of you who are in Canada or know Canada, I live in Ontario, which is a province that's burned its last lump of coal sometime in the last decade or so, a little longer. We are not an oil producing region, Alberta is. And so very often people in Ontario will look west, and I hate to admit it, but it happens. People in Ontario will look west and say, are you gonna get your act together? Don't you care about your kids? Well, if we lived in a fantasy world where oil and gas were benign, which it's not, but manufacturing an automobile automatically fried the planet when used as directed, then the target would be in Ontario, and don't imagine for a moment that anyone in this province would not be as terrified. And what's at the base of that is that nobody who's lived through the last era believes that there's a safety net that'll catch them, believes that they'll have the time and the space and the opportunity to really think through what they would like what's next to be, rather than just buffet it along. And I think that need is where just transition creates sort of a dialogue elsewhere, an imperative elsewhere, that I would love to see basic income attach itself to. What we've been seeing in our work so far is that we're not going out to potential community partners, and nor should we, and saying, hey, we see this connection, do you like us yet? We're going out to people essentially asking what's going on in the communities and communities of interest that they're a part of, and whether these kinds of connections maybe resonate, maybe could help, maybe could make a bit of a difference. And you can tell this conversation better than I can, Janet, because you're in more of the conversations, but the reaction has been just spectacular. People are so thrilled just to be able to think about the intersections between these issues. And we all know it's a long way from thinking about it to actually getting there, but it starts by thinking about it. It starts by talking about it. And anything we're seeing on green resilience so far is that these connections really do make sense. The only, and they make sense at the grassroots, they make sense from the front lines, and they may not make sense, for example, to the fossil fuel lobbyists whose press conference I was just covering at the COP an hour ago. But it makes sense where it matters, and that is to people and to communities. The one other point is you were referring briefly, Janet, to whether people believe that climate change is real. And I've kind of made a side habit or a side practice, because honestly, the conversations are so much better this way that it's fun, of trying to see how deep into the conversation I can get without using any of the C words. So climate, crisis, carbon, right? And if the conversation starts out with a household or a neighborhood where too many people are having to choose between food and fuel, I don't know in what universe reducing their emissions will be the best way to get a deep retrofit done in their home so that the energy bill goes away. Anybody who's in climate needs to get that the first argument is, you mean I don't have to make that choice anymore, right? And there are so many other examples of that. People who love their wild spaces, people who insist on their bike path, people who'd be delighted not to have to drive to the supermarket for a carton of milk. Those are all climate messages, because the solutions that address those basic living problems end up driving down emissions as well. They won't get us everywhere we need to go. We need structural change as well. But what that does do is give people the idea that climate action isn't scary. It ties in with what I'm already trying to do in my life. Now let's solve the fossil fuel economy. So I think I should probably stop there for now, but I think those are the connections I hope I see between the two areas.
No, I think that's really great. We've talked a lot about I think how economic resilience, social resilience, and environmental resilience are resilience for humans, for our Earth, just overall. I see there are questions coming in through the questions box. Please do, rather than the chat box, if you could put your questions into the Q&A box, we'll turn there in a couple of minutes to take questions from the audience. I just have a couple more of my own for anyone. What evidence do we have that shows that basic income can actually help us achieve what we're talking about here in terms of resilience?
Yeah, I'm certainly happy to talk some evidence here. So, like a few things. I would start off first. Like a piece of evidence I think is really interesting to the whole climate conversation is that in Indonesia there was this program of providing cash to like over 100,000 low-income people there, and one of the results of that was that they found it actually led to 30% less deforestation. And so, like, just from hearing that, you can tell that people were cutting down forests simply to get money in order to live. And then if they had the money already, then they could still buy the food and stuff that they needed to live, but they no longer needed to cut down all the trees around them. And so I think that's even like a metaphor for just so much of what humanity is doing on planet Earth, is just doing so many things that are entirely unnecessary. Like there's this one like comic strip that I like a 4-panel of like someone cutting down a tree, and then as they cut it down, like the birds who were living there like fly off, and then the person like turns it into a birdhouse, and and then the birds come back into this house, and it's like, well, that was wasteful. So I think that to a large degree we're doing a lot of that. But as far as like even more evidence to another piece is from the Namibia pilot, and that was the EBI pilot actually in Namibia, and they found that illegal hunting was reduced by 95%. So like that's another example of people were doing something that's entirely unsustainable that can lead to, you know, the eradication of animal species, and they were doing it just because they needed the money to survive. And so again, you just made sure people had that money unconditionally, and they no longer needed to turn to this thing that they obviously didn't want to be doing because of the drastic reduction that was possible from doing that. And I would also point out to things like you know, the impacts on homelessness. Like when there have been programs recently that actually focus on providing cash explicitly to people who are experiencing homelessness, and the effects have been just very impressive, and like shockingly so to people who thought that, housing was too expensive. That's not going to work. You really have to provide housing, or people aren't going to, maybe they're going to use drugs or something instead of paying for housing. And that's not the case. Like people who are experiencing homelessness are just like everyone else. And when they actually have money, then they're able to afford housing. And so one of the recent things during COVID in the Bay Area was this nonprofit just decided to focus on, I think it was like 12 people experiencing homelessness. And they just provided them $500 a month for, I think it was like at least like 6 months or something. And so you would think like the Bay Area being one of the most expensive places to live in the country, that's just not going to do anything. And it turned out that about half of them were able to find stable housing. And that's just like so much more above and beyond what a lot of other programs have as a success rate. And so this nonprofit even was like, wow, like, first of all, we should be doing more of this, but then also they think so many other nonprofits should be thinking about actually just using at least some of their revenue, some of their funding as cash directly to people to fit whatever their mission is to help those people. Because it's just, again, like such an efficient way of helping people, just put that trust and that ability to secure resources into people's hands directly, to trust them. And it makes a big difference. So like, there's just so much other evidence that, I'd love to get into as far as, improved health and reduced crime and all these other things. But it really, I just suggest that people even look into the evidence and see just how many things it impacts. And again, just from the plugging this in the climate picture, how important that is in order to, especially to like afford more sustainable choices versus the choices that people are basically having no choice but to make now to a large degree.
Thanks, Scott. Does anyone else want to touch on the evidence question before we move on? Jim.
Just very quickly, just to add to some of Scott's examples and maybe a bit closer to home. The Ontario Basic Income pilots that were launched in 2017 by the former provincial government under Kathleen Wynne, and then were canceled a year later by the newly elected government of Doug Ford, Conservative government. I mean, we didn't get the whole rich set of data we were hoping to get from those pilots because it was cut off 2 years early. But there has been some interesting findings about what happened to people, especially in Hamilton and Lindsay, 2 of the 3 pilot sites, that receiving a basic income, their lives became more predictable and kind of orderly, and some of the what you might call the desperate and chaotic consumption patterns associated with chronic poverty, like Scott mentioned, people showing up at homeless shelters or emergency wards or things like that, with some reliable, even if it's not a full adequate income, with some measure of financial security, people can order their lives and their consumption patterns in a way that help them, but also maybe don't waste public resources. In fact, there was an interesting piece of academic research that was published earlier this year in Basic Income Studies that it was kind of a sort of looking at literature and a sort of a simulation that people were asked questions, but it was found that a modest UBI would actually wouldn't add unduly to consumption patterns, and once again might help people live more stable and predictable and self-directed lives that got them out of the traps of chronic poverty and the crises that accompany that, which also have environmental consequences in terms of using public resources.
Thanks, Jim. And so I think my final question to everyone is, where do we go from here? How do we achieve our ambitious targets by 2030, by 2050? Is anybody at COP26 talking about basic income? Like, how do we get there?
Well, first of all, as far as I know, I mean, the COP is always a 30-ring circus in both quantity and I fear quality. So there may be people in some side sessions talking about basic income, and I'm sorry I haven't found that before joining this call. To my knowledge, it's nowhere near the negotiations. They're in a whole other universe. And honestly, the essentials of a 1.5 degree limit and of climate finance and some of those issues seem to be pretty far from the center of the negotiations at this point as well, at least any realistic solutions on those. So, but time will tell. As far as anything coming out of the climate space, what we're seeing, first of all, in the United States, is that the first part of the infrastructure package has finally passed, and the second, we hope, is on the way. So that will lead to not nearly as much or as solid and integrated work on the transition of carbon as we need, but it will still be really significant. What we already have is being called the biggest climate investment the country's ever made. So again, it needs a lot more, but we have a lot to work with. In Canada, during our recent federal election, the then candidate, now re-elected Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, promised a cap on oil and gas emissions, and then a declining target every 5 years. He promised a 75% reduction in methane, which is a greenhouse gas that comes both from coal mines and from natural gas production. It's 80 to 86 times more potent a greenhouse gas over a 20-year span. And I'm sorry about all the jargon I'm throwing out here. I'm starting to sound like the COP, and that's not a good thing. But basically, those kinds of actions, there's still a lot to find out. There could be loopholes, they could be delayed, all of that. But if it happens, to the extent that it happens, if it's done right, that will create a lot of focused attention on the reality that both the need for this transition, because of the acceleration of the climate crisis, and the reality, the opportunity, right? That we keep saying that working on climate change can be about opportunity and gain, not loss and pain, but we have to make it so. And with these big picture initiatives, programs, policies, we hope taking shape and going well, there'll be a lot of need to pay attention and a lot of momentum to pay attention to how that plays for people. And then once again, I really hope by then we'll have some wonderful grassroots community-based evidence from the conversations that our project is fostering to help feed the conversation that yes, basic income can't just be on the side of this, it has to be right at the center.
I think that's a good point. Janet, as the coordinator of the Green Resilience Project, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what you're hoping to achieve, starting from the communities upwards.
Yeah, I'll just back up and just explain for anyone who doesn't know that the Green Resilience Project is organizing a series of conversations across Canada, 25 to 35 conversations. And the whole idea is that, no community knows itself better than the community itself. So we're partnering with local partners in communities to host conversations around the links between climate change, income security, and community resilience. There is an urgent need for new thinking and leadership, and that's where we'll find it. As I'm talking to people across the country, I'm encountering hope and grief and frustration and some really incredible ideas and initiatives that are happening across the country. We're asking people to tell us what they need to be resilient and who's responsible for it and how is it gonna happen. We'll have to wait and see what part in all of this community members feel basic income will play. I can't speak for the communities. That's sort of the whole idea, is that they'll speak for themselves, and we're still waiting to hear back from them. But and also for anyone listening, we are still seeking partners, so do reach out if you're interested. But yeah, it remains to be seen. To me, it makes sense that basic income will have a part to play, but we're waiting to hear.
All right, now looking at some of the questions in the questions box, speaking of hope, there are a couple in here about the carbon fee and dividends. Scott, I think you've done some work on that. So maybe we'll start with Scott, but then if anyone else wants to jump in, can you tell us a little bit more about the promise of carbon dividends, and if this is an opportunity for environmental and UBI communities to work together?
Yeah, I've long thought that an annually rising carbon fee and dividend approach is really just like a no-brainer kind of three birds with one stone kind of policy. Where so for those who aren't familiar, this is just you apply a fee per ton to to greenhouse gas emitters at the source, and let's say you start at $40 per ton, and every year it goes up $10, so 50, 60, 70, 80, going up and up and up, and it just continues going up. So over time it gets more and more expensive to pollute and emit these greenhouse gases that we want to reduce. And at the same time, this dividend is rising if you're providing that revenue back to people. And I think it's really important to provide that revenue back to people, because if you don't do that, we're seeing, I think it's been a constant roadblock to preventing carbon pricing from happening, from people, saying like, well, I'm barely getting by as it is, and you want to raise the price of gas, which is going to make, the price of to get to work and my commute's going to cost more, and the price of food is going to cost more because of the cost passed on to transportation, and so like everything's going to cost more, but I'm not going to get a raise, so like it's just going to hurt me, and so I'm going to be against that. But it is possible to actually utilize that revenue gained from the rising carbon fees to actually make sure that people, not only are those expenses are covered, but they can actually be net recipients, so that they actually do get a raise even above and beyond what they're now paying for the carbon pricing. And so it is possible for carbon taxation to actually be progressive instead of regressive, as long as you have this cash rebate component. And I think even like an interesting example of something like this too is actually in Iran. And so Iran had all these subsidies that they were using to make their oil cheaper, and they were doing that so that if you're a low income person and you have cheap oil, then you can heat your house cheaply and you're okay. Result of that is, from these really cheap oil, is that you had people who were rich who were just like driving around in their sports cars and just like burning gas like crazy. And they're like, well, how do we fix this? If we remove the subsidies, then it's going to make the cost of heating oil and stuff go up, and it's going to hurt all these people. So let's actually, at the same time as reducing these subsidies, let's basically cash them out and provide people this cash transfer. And it was basically a basic income at one point, when it was going to say over 95% of the population. And it was extremely popular, and it did have the impact of actually reducing the as much waste that they were doing, because suddenly if you makes it cost more to fill up your sports car, even though you're rich, so you don't do that as much. And so it enables people to make these better choices where they shrink their carbon footprint in order to utilize more of the dividend that they're getting back. And then you actually have that extra money to invest in green sources. You can get solar panels for your house, electric cars become more affordable, like these kinds of things. And so I hope over time, and I hope even right now, that each nation is going to look more and more at this annually rising carbon pricing. And if you're going to do that, just the cash rebate makes so much sense. And I think once people get used to getting this cash every month and see the impacts, it's going to make basic income make a lot more sense.
And I just, if there's time, if I can just come in quickly and say that the carbon pricing, carbon tax system that you've just described is what Canada basically ended up putting in place. So when it was first introduced, it was at $10 a ton, and there was much mockery. The idea, as you say, it would increase by $10 per ton per year, hitting $50, I think, in 2022. But the idea now is that it's being further increased to a ceiling of 170 in 2030. Now, there are two ways that the revenue from a carbon price or a carbon tax can be used. One is to invest them in carbon reduction projects, and the other, as you say, is to put the lion's share or all of the money back into people's pockets, so that it's no longer a regressive tax. And I have to admit that when those options were first on the table, I have to admit to a group of many dozen people that I was dead wrong in my initial assessment of it. I originally came out of the renewable energy and energy efficiency space. That's a lot of where I still spend my time. And my reaction was, we finally have money for building retrofits. What are you doing? That will help people. And that was the wrong reaction. Yes, some of the money should go into these projects, but the idea that it comes back to people that level the tax. And I love your point that it amounts to a basic income. It has not only made carbon pricing, after a long fight, made carbon pricing an accepted, expected part of Canadian climate policy. But last week, our Prime Minister was in Glasgow with several announcements and proposals, and one of them was a proposal to take the concept global, based on the example that's been established here, and many others, I'm sure.
That's great. Thank you so much. We are at 1 p.m. Eastern now, so I'm going to take us into some closing announcements, but we had lots of great questions in the chat box and in the questions box, including, does it have to be basic income? You know, there are lots of different ways to cut a pie or slice a pie. Does it have to be basic income? And I will put that question out to the panelists to respond to in writing following this webinar. So keep an eye on your email, and we'll provide you some extra written responses to your questions. Thank you, Mitchell, Janet, Scott, Jim, for joining us on today's webinar. It was so much fun. For everyone listening, if you enjoyed this webinar, you might also be interested in exploring how a collective impact can support climate change movement and empower us to make population level change at a community level. So our ED, or our co-CEO, Paul Bourne, as well as Kathy Wright, who is a seasoned poverty reduction change maker in collective impact, will be joined by Shannon Frazen and Tika Newton with Climate Action Now to share their experiences with the collective impact approach. Also, on the same day, the evening of November 17th, you can join the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, as well as Basic Income Canada Youth Network to celebrate the wrap up of the Basic Income Bought Me social media campaign. The campaign has been highlighting voices of lived experience from the Ontario Basic Income Pilots, how participants spent their basic income payments, the power of choice, and they sought to challenge harmful stereotypes about poverty, social assistance, and basic income. So MP Leah Gazan and Senator Kim Pate, along with several basic income pilots, are going to be featured in the wrap-up call, as well as the screening of the Canadian premiere of the short documentary, A Human Picture. So we have a full list of upcoming webinars with Tamarack found on our event listing. So I will send you that link, as well as the link to the 2 opportunities that I just mentioned in the follow-up, along with Jim's slides and the recording of today's webinar. So thank you for learning with us today. Please send any comments or questions to me at natasha@tamarackcommunity.ca, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.